broad idea, if you could take everything back and make it so simple, which it will never be, would you look towards more technique training for your sparring, or would you be looking at more free stuff and like semi-free sparring, I guess, and sparring only options? So we can see there's a 78% in favor of the sparring option and 22% in technique, which is interesting. I think that alone is a little bit of an interesting fact of what people kind of conceive to be the go-tos for sparring and sparring development. So what are your thoughts initially off the bat on that one, Adrian?
Yeah, I think when you give people two kind of polarized ideas, you end up missing all of the gray areas in between, right. and that's deliberate. I mean, you know, we're looking to see what's people's if you had to do one of two, which would you go for? So I think everybody recognizes that you can't be effective in sparring without good technique. But the problem is, good technique isn't something that can be done in isolation, because what we would call is, you know, we would often have the technique and skill being, you know, technique is the idea of, well, it's what it would be if there was no opposition, if it was completely on you to deliver it, whereas skill is it's the application of technique under match-like conditions and pressure. So
yeah, very dynamic situation.
Totally different. Yeah. So the where and how you learn your technique and how you learn to apply it in sparring, I suppose, is the underlying thing. And obviously, the trend from this particular poll is that, well, look, if you had to do one, you'll probably learn more by sparring than you will by only practicing technique. And I definitely agree with the sentiment of that.
So, like the background or context behind this is, for me personally, how I run my sessions is, for sparring development, I actually try to focus more on the sparring side and the live stuff a little bit more, because for most of my sessions and most of my students, I'm only going to see them twice a week.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and when you have to break that time into patterns, you have to break it into kicking, you have to, so many different facets of Taekwondo, that we don't actually get that much time being able to spend developing our sparring skills. So I think that I try to maximize that time the most by actually doing that. So what we'll do is generally actually give people a general feel of a technique, like we see, for example, here. Try bringing that into a bit of a live situation as early as we can. But I don't spend a lot of time drilling perfect technique on combinations. Why? I personally don't believe there's any such thing as a perfect technique. You never see the same technique twice. And that has been proved by research and backed by skill acquisition research as well. And basically how people that are experts in a particular field execute a skill is they actually adjust in motion usually. So, for example, something going for a kick, your opponent slightly shifts back a little bit and you just have to extend the distance a bit more, or as you're lifting your knee, someone closes you down. You just have to make some adjustments with the body. So it's that type of thing there, which is subconscious most of the time, and you pick that up from being in those situations. So your body kind of builds those neurological pathways as such for you and your brain to be able to do things, and a lot of time you don't even notice it. So how basically the question I'm asking myself now is, as I'm getting a couple of black belts who I'm just thinking, okay, maybe we can just tidy up a few bits here. Is ITF sparring a particular sport where we can look at technique a little bit later as you understand how to do the game of sparring, or should we be looking at technique very early and then worrying about the skills later? So just a little bit of an thought experiment really, and hopefully that we can pick up some things there that people will find of value as a result.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you have to consider when you start thinking about that, and just for people who are watching in the background, you'll start to see different varieties of trainings with different degrees of freedom, as we call it, or different levels of opposition to what's going on. So from completely capacity building cooperative drilling to things where it's entirely opposed and it's basically free sparring with constraints. So you'll see, quite a spectrum of that going on in the background, and we might dig back into that in a little while as the conversation goes on. But to go to Richie's point there, I think the issue that we have is, if you were doing a sport like basketball, you can isolate some of the skills out of it in some ways, like the free throw, like some of the passing, but in reality they all happen within, you know, the context of the game. But there's an additional dimension, I think, that comes into it with a combat sport. And even as light contact as, you know, we might be, you're still getting punched and kicked in the face. A back kick to the ribs still is a back kick to the ribs, and you're going to feel it. And we need to develop an attitude and a character and a willingness to both suffer a little bit and to you know,
battle,
to be physical. Yeah, we need to have that as well. And you just don't develop that, you know, in a scenario like this, you know, and that's the reality. You need to bring in someone who doesn't want to get hit, who does want to hit you, who wants to impose their will on this scenario to see if your skill happens. And then you get the chicken and egg argument again, Richie, then, isn't it? Which is like, if you take you know, your example and you say, well, at least, you know, over the first few years, I think it's more important that they understand you know, what works for them within the basic tag scenario of the game of hit and don't get hit, and then refine skill based on, you know, the things that emerge from there, and figure out. That's almost like a play, practice, play mentality, that, you know, it's more important to play the game a lot, and then you pick out things that need triage, you know, as necessary. So it's like, okay, well, this isn't working for you because, oh, well, we'll address that for a little while today. Versus the opposite, which might be a case of the more traditional coaching approach, which is I decide what skills you need to have. Then I work on those skills with ever increasing levels of challenge until I'm happy that that skill is where it needs to be. And then you try to integrate that into your sparring. So where's the problem with, or the potential problem with either or both approaches?
Well, for me, I think that, like, how I look at it really is yellow belt is where we start sparring with younger kids, right? So for that, I'm looking at very simple things of a task of you're landing your glove on the other person's helmet, and like find ways to do that. And then, like, if you see things that are like that, you know, as a coach, that like, okay, that's not going to be a good solution going forward, you try to address that pretty quick, as you say. For example, stepping on side kicks a lot. So you try to address that, and then you make that like a condition where you need to land your sidekick position on the person's body. That's how simple it is, but you're not allowed to step before you lift your leg. And like, that's how I will look at the technique then, that kind of way. And then you'll actually see the people will come up with their own solutions and use quite clever ways to play the game. Because for me, I think that playing the game is the fun part for kids and for young adults, of course, as well. And for people who are starting this journey, wherever you may be. But like, you don't want to be just doing the drills all the time, because I find that even at the high level, I think personally that people spend too much time hitting the pads and combinations at like high level international black belts for the purpose of developing their sparring training in terms of like their skill. And like, skill is not hitting gloves. You know, it's a completely different thing. So you need to be in the context of sparring. And we see it. It's like somebody moves to the left, somebody moves to the right. You got to adjust and make a better decision there. And I feel personally, the more you're put in the position to make those decisions, the better you will get at the game and the skill of sparring.
For sure. And a little away from tarnish there. So, and it's important, you know, you look at what's going on in the background here. This isn't people developing their sparring skill. This is people doing a fitness exercise that's quite specific to sparring. But it looks like, and if you were to come across this on Instagram, you'd assume, oh yeah, these guys are practicing countering a sidekick. It's like, yeah, kind of, but not really. Like, because the sidekick isn't going to be thrown in that rhythm, that nice predictable rhythm to the same target on the same length and distance. No, this is just an opportunity to develop your match-specific fitness in a particular way. And, you know, that's what we're trying to do in this. And yeah, there's a bit of contact and there's a little consequence if there's a mistake. But for the most part, this is very just, it's repetition. And there was there is a difference between something that is requiring practice and something that's requiring training. And then something that requires a combination of the both. So the way I would kind of think of it is, training is to improve a physical characteristic. So in other words, I need to improve my aerobic metabolism. Okay, I need to go into a particular heart rate training zone. I need to stay there for a particular length of time. I need to do that over however long. Or I need to lift an ever increasing like weight in order to get stronger. So that's training. Practice is for skill, for accuracy, for things like that. And if you're performing your pattern, then that repetition, that practice, leads to increasing accuracy over time. But there's a combination part of it there, which is where we need skill. We need both repetition, but also increasing challenge, and we need that loading, we need that training effect of it, and we have to get that right. And I think there's a tendency from a coach's point of view to want to control everything, so we can make everything look better when we set the parameters for success, and we narrow the whole experience to where success is likely. But as long as the person holds the pad and moves at a predictable speed, and the person starts in the same position and they refine their technique until they can achieve that. But the second you tell the person with the pad, well, you can go or not go, or go fast, or have a preemptive movement before you go, and you can hit them, all of a sudden that sidekick, it doesn't work so well anymore. But it's far more realistic. And I think the art of the coaching is figuring out what is more useful, what's going to get the biggest improvement in the shortest amount of time, and that also has to take in what it has to be fun, it has to be enjoyable, it has to be a level of challenge, because that's one of the hardest things, isn't it? Of like, if you get people and it's like, okay, we're going to drill sidekick again, everybody get 2 lines in the center with a kick shield. There's already a sense of, you're not going to apply yourself.
I've done that a couple of times by now,
Yeah, you're not going to apply yourself in the same way. Whereas the second you say, okay, you have to try and tag your opponent, and they have to try and punch you in the shoulder. It's like, oh, all right. Now straight away we don't know what's going to happen first, and once we get into that,
more engaging for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. So there's also an art, I think, in figuring out how to balance. Not too much challenge, not too little challenge. Make it so that both people have an opportunity for success. And ideally, the scenario or the training itself will give some feedback as to whether the technique is being successful or not, and will allow some opportunities to develop an alternative if it's not within the person's repertoire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like for me personally, where I'm coming at from this is from my own personal experience of putting in some particular shots.
Yeah.
An example, banded dolly chagi. I couldn't do that in a sparring context until I was a black belt. And I actually had a good understanding of the game at this stage. I was competing international level. And then I started to work on this technique. So I started off in isolation, just working on it on the freestanding bag, just working on getting the head lower and the rotation and the landing, things like that. And then you start to bring it into your sparring training. When you can, you got to have that mindset in your free sparring then of, I need to look for opportunities for this. And then you kind of get better and better. And then eventually I was able to actually land it in international competition, which is probably where you want to be the upper level of what you want the skill to do. But like that didn't start with me as a young kid, as a blue belt, like hitting banded olios on the pad forever and forever and forever, and then linking them up with other combinations around those techniques. So that's kind of where my thinking is here now, is that should we maybe look at playing the game and understanding the game at the lower levels, yellow belt, green belt, blue belt, even to red belt, and then any technical focus then we can look at, because as well for people who are not adults, most people will get to the black belt stage at the like 14, 15 mark, and again their body is changing and they're only kind of learning the coordination of their techniques and stuff then again. So I think that is like a good opportunity to kind of sneak in there while they're kind of figuring out their own bodies again, to be able to develop maybe like just more precise techniques, things like the banded olio, things like just punching with the arms kind of flaying out and the elbows very wide and loose, and just things like that. And most of the skills they'll have a good understanding of already because they have to get into a certain level. But there are certain shots that you need to just kind of like be a bit more precise. And so that's kind of where my thinking is just like, can we almost flip it the other way around and do the technique a little bit later while still trying to have a good understanding of where, like, what technique is effective.
And I think what you're kind of describing there as well is the idea that when a person has a need for the technique or a need for the refinement of the technique later on, they're already invested, they've already done a lot of the training, and now they have a reason to spend dedicated time focusing on something that they've found a need for themselves, which is a little bit different to taking 20 people in a class and saying, okay, you all need to do this particular thing and you need to do it in this particular way. Because once we start defining that technique as, well, your side kick must be lift and shift from the front leg, it must be with a high knee chamber, it must be whatever, you've alienated half the class already, because some of them won't be able to do lift and shift, or their sparring stance won't contribute to that, or in fact they don't ever want to throw a side kick because they're going to spar half facing and they're going to be using a different strategy anyway. So I think what I would do is I'd take it back to the idea that, well, okay, if I was handed a group of kids in the morning and said, okay, you're not going to teach them Taekwondo, we're going to teach them soccer. They've never seen a ball before. Okay, what would you do to start? And the question is, do you teach them, how to pass with the inside of the foot, over a short distance from one to the other and control it, and control and stop the ball? Or do you create some sort of small-sided game that gets them scoring goals? Because, in the end, a lot, straight away, because you want them to actually enjoy the game. You want them to get some understanding of the game. And then at a later date, maybe the next session or in the middle of the session, you want them to understand how to control the ball so it doesn't bounce off them and, they miss opportunities to score a goal. Maybe someone has just missed their opportunity to score because they tried to control the ball, or they tried to kick it without controlling it first and it went off, 10 meters wide. Now you can say, but try this. And you can have a brief session of getting some control on the ball and then back into the game. And then maybe that's the bit that they do in the beginning, or that they do with their friends later when they're practicing on their own, or, but the first thing you want to do is play the game a little bit. And and certainly, even if with the white belts, it starts something as simple as shoulder tag, or, or some sort of like push versus tag or something along those lines, just to get that initial appreciation of, hit and don't get hit, how it might look and feel. I think that's a much more important way to start, and we can start building that character and attitude and everything from the beginning then,
Well, what I've seen based on that is, like, I do a lot of that kind of movement drills with the white belts with another partner, the likes of the shoulder tag, likes of the kick to the backside and stuff like that, just to understand the distance and the timing and the hit, don't get hit mentality. And then what I've actually seen is when I put sparring gear on these guys for the first time as yellow belts, their footwork and their movement is actually quite good.
Yeah, they don't look like first timers.
Yeah, exactly. They're not beginners in terms of that respect, because they know the idea of hit and don't get hit, and how to hold the stance and how to move their feet. Like I've actually stopped doing all these like hoop drills with the footwork patterns and the ladder drills and all that, and I've stopped that now for a good while. And all we do for footwork training now with the beginners is work on tag variations to see different. And I've actually seen it then when they jump into the yellow belt group and they start sparring for the first time, they're able to move, they're able to control their body much better.
Yeah.
Because like we spend a lot of time on like these particular steps and stuff. And then when you think about it, when you watch a fight there, it's very rare that these particular steps pop up, and we're spending loads of time on getting these perfect. And of course you want a good broad base of being able to move. But
yes,
you get that from just being able to tag each other and not get hit. The task itself is what is going to cause that. So I think that's how I'm looking at it at the minute, and that's where I'm kind of putting a big focus. And I think that it's working well, because last night, for example, we spoke to Adrian before we came on recording. We did like a team sparring session for a bit of fun, where you just team sparring in the group, and the coaching from the guys on the side was incredible, because they like the intelligence of the sparring brain that some of them had at like blue belt even was really impressive. And I was really impressed with it, like the stuff they were coaching each other with. They were telling each other to watch out for particular things and get your leg up first, and all these really high level things that I was really impressed from blue belts. So I think that's kind of what the result of playing the game is, as opposed to if you're just hitting combinations on the glove all day long, they're not developing that understanding and that like decision making that's going to be needed then at that high level.
And just while you were chatting there, I said I'd have a look for one or two bits, because I knew I took a few videos there a little while ago where we're looking at some white belts who've thrown on a pair of borrowed gloves or whatever for the first time, and who've never been taught what a sparring stance is. And when you look at the movement that emerges, and again, it's a white belt against a blue belt here, but like when you look at the movement that emerges, it's like, well, yeah, that's more or less what a sparring stance should look like. Yep. And and there's a reason for that, is because over time you've realized, okay, if I want to be able to control the distance and do something with my legs and hands, well, away we go. But also because, you know what, when we kick, we stand on one leg. So so it's just that little bit of an appreciation of distance. All of that comes from some basic games. And again, these guys at this stage are, they don't own gloves yet. They've borrowed gloves in order to kind of to take part in a bit of the session with the more experienced guys. And like you said, yeah, sometimes I'll pull out the tools and I'll do all of those things, but to address something that's emerged because it's become relevant to the person, So it's like, oh, okay, we've seen something from a tournament, we're doing something in training, and a person's getting caught because they're stepping into their side kick. It's like, okay, well, maybe we put out a hoop, then we create some challenges to see if they can lift that, and then we put them straight back into the same scenario again and see, okay, well, how does that change things? But yeah, more and more and more, I'm looking for ways to let it emerge from the game. And
and it is hard at the beginning, because as a coach you kind of have to do a little bit less interrupting, and that can be tough when you have the answer and you want to give it to the students, you want to help them, and you almost feel like, am I doing my job here? But you need to almost let them figure out a little bit, and as you said, pick the right moments to help them out and give them some guidance. But you need to kind of almost like bite your tongue at moments, because and I know you're quite similar to me as well, when we have an idea of how to help people, we're looking to give it to them because we want to help. And then sometimes we interrupt the session because of that. And sometimes the real work is coming from the interaction they have with the other person they're sparring with.
Yeah. And it's sometimes just looking for different solutions. Like, they may not need you to step in and tell them what to do. They may need you to give them a new opponent, to add a restriction or a constraint to one person in order to let what they're doing happen, to put them in a corner and see how it goes, to to take away their punches, so they have to find a way to use the legs or the movement differently. And sometimes you're helping them. And I think what I always try to remind myself of is, try to remember what it's like when you find the solution to a problem, rather than being told what the answer is. And it is that feeling. You're trying to, give them the ability to solve problems for themselves. And, even at the most fundamental and basic level, where, let's say, we talked about this actually over the last couple of weeks, you go to the tournament, I was finding some of my guys, the solution that they'd worked out to someone pressing them with the front leg was, well, I move back and I attack the dropping leg. And it was effective for them in the class. But then they moved up from yellow-green to blue-red. And the people at blue-red were better able to mix the distance that, on the side kick, go a little longer, carry and double up the front leg, front leg drop to hands. And so their strategy didn't work anymore. But you could say, well, oh, that's a very bad thing, because they should know that, because I should have told them that, because we should have coached that. But the reality is as well, is like, well, sure, but now they have an experience. They now, when they go to their training, understand a little bit why reacting by going back isn't always the best choice. And this is people that was perfectly effective for up until a point. And that's how skill progresses. It's like a more rudimentary version of the skill will do just fine and allow them to progress up to a point. But then beyond that, you need something a little more. You need, you need to add in nuance. It's not that the skill needs to completely change, but it needs to develop, in terms of its intricacy and nuance, and their understanding of it has to improve. And when that happens, great, they'll have a new skill that they can add in at the end there. So maybe sometimes they'll pull, maybe sometimes they'll push, like we had the guys there with the backhand in our Fight Chat Friday episode this week. Who knows what they'll develop? Maybe they'll do something else entirely, and they'll like use that pull to draw the person onto a switch back kick or something. We don't, we'll see what comes out of it. But you can't be so afraid as a coach to let people learn for themselves from losing as well. I think it's an important part of it.
I think though, like, that's one of the reasons I put up the poll originally. I think that, like I have a bit of a theory that if you just put people in there and just let them spar, and you never ever spoke to them as a coach, and you just let them figure it out themselves, this is what the game looks like, go and play the game, here are the rules. I think that they would probably end up doing pretty well. And I think that the people that you have at a high level would probably still succeed like they do, and obviously then there's levels to this where you can help people. That's where you come in as a coach.
That's
But
that's
I
all
feel
about
like
efficiency.
exactly.
Yeah.
But if you removed it, I think they would do probably just as well.
Okay, so the summary I'm getting from that is this. If you had people and you trained them and you only focused on training their technique and then put them into sparring, we're not expecting a good outcome. If you just said once a week, everybody for 30 minutes, spar a new opponent every 2 minutes, they'll get a much closer approximation of a decent, sparring outcome. They'll probably do better when it comes to the tournament. But it could take quite a long time before, and you might lose a lot of people to frustration before they get to the point where they're truly effective. The best ones will probably come through, but you'll lose a lot more people along the way because they're getting frustrated with a lack of success. So the question is how much to interfere with the process, how much to take away from the, or to pull out of the free sparring experience in order to make the process of developing your skill that bit more efficient.
Well, I've actually personally found that when we kind of go with this little bit of a system recently, that the retention in terms of the people staying on and as students is actually much better.
Yeah.
Because there's less of this like monotonous kick the pad, or I've done this last week, I did it a week before. Like this is not very exciting after I do it a couple of times, especially for the higher levels, the blues and reds. Where now like every session is different because we're coming up with different situations. Like we can make 100 situations from a sparring match, and let's go practice the situation and go in there and just jump in. Here's the situation. And then the guys are actually picking their own situations from there as well. They're like, okay, how about we try adding this in, or how about we do it in the corner, or how about we reduce the time? So I think that like giving them a little bit of ownership of it as well is actually letting them enjoy their training much, much more.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? So I don't know if there's a particular closing statement that you want to make, or just for the members there, but definitely I would say to people, if this isn't something you're trying, consider it. Really have a think about, and I don't mean consider just doing free sparring. I'm saying,
Yeah.
consider how much time you're spending drilling your idea onto your students, or trying to make a skill perfect in a limited environment where it's not opposed, and consider instead maybe how much time you're giving your students to develop a fuller understanding of what the game looks like, feels like, and how they might play it.
Absolutely. I think that that's a great way to sum it up, because as you said, it's not just, we don't want to just do free sparring, because again, as a coach, you have an idea of things that will help them. So you can kind of gauge of scenarios that are best. Let's do a side kick versus a turning kick or something like that. And that's not free sparring essentially, because it's constrained. So I think that having an understanding of what the big picture looks like and try to work on skills from there, skills being the operative word as opposed to techniques, how you get that technique to work basically is the skill. I think that that's the key.